The Jets got onto the practice field on Thursday. Let's talk about how they look in the trenches heading into the 2023 season. That's ahead today on Locked On Jets.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. It's Friday, July 21st, 2023, and I'm your host, John B. from GangGreenNation.com. Thanking you so much for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. Subscribe to the show for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts so that you'll get new episodes as soon as they're posted. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, please give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube, give this episode a big thumbs up. These things help us out and help other Jets fans find the show. Well, the Jets hit the practice field yesterday. The big story was Aaron Rodgers, although it sounds like it was a quiet day for the future Hall of Fame quarterback, his first practice in training camp with the Jets. But today we're going to focus on the trenches. We're going to take stock of where the Jets are at on the offensive line, on the defensive line, and at linebacker, even though I guess you could argue maybe they're not technically in the trenches. They play close to the line of scrimmage. So it's trench day here on Locked On Jets. And we're going to begin by taking a look at the offensive line, where things stand heading into training camp. And there are a lot of question marks about the way the Jets are going to line up this year along the offensive line. There are some potential position battles out there. We don't know the extent to which these position battles are going to play out. Robert Saleh through the offseason has said the 5 best players are going to play, which I don't know that that's the way I would necessarily put it, because you could find yourself in a situation where your 5 best play. I'm not saying this is the Jets, but I don't like framing any offensive line alignment that way, because what if your 5 best players are all guards? Well, your line would not work. So you have to find the 5 players who work the best together. It's not necessarily the 5 most talented players. It's the 5 players who work best with each other along the offensive line. And what's interesting about this is there's only one player who I am absolutely convinced is going to be starting at a specific spot, and that's Laken Tomlinson at left guard. Like, that's the only guy who's 100% starting at a specific spot. There's one other guy who I feel like there's probably like a 90% chance he's at a certain spot, and that's Elijah Vera Tucker. Now, I think there's a 100% chance Elijah Vera Tucker is going to be a starter for the Jets. It's just a question of where he plays. And I'm like 90% he's going to be at right guard, because the Jets have brought in a lot of tackles over the course of the offseason. They've made interesting moves. They've kept certain players who maybe you thought they'd get rid of. My guess is Vera Tucker plays at right guard. If you wanted to tell me he eventually moves out to tackle or something, I think I could believe it. But I think that most likely he's going to be guard. And I know somebody's going to email me saying, you're wrong, he's not going to play tackle. I just told you there's a 90% chance. I'm maybe leaving maybe 10% that he's going to move out to tackle. So really the actions at 2 spots, the actions at center and the actions at tackle. Now, center is a little bit more straightforward. Now, I've discussed this on the show recently. I think the Jets want Joe Tippmann to win this starting job. They drafted him, in the second round with a, early to middle of the second round draft pick. That's a guy you want into the lineup. And beyond that, although I think Connor McGovern's been a very effective player for this team the last 2.5 years, I think the first half of his initial season with the Jets was a little shaky. He's provided stability at center, a position that really held the Jets back for a good 3 to 4 year stretch prior to his arrival and after Nick Mangold's retirement. And McGovern stabilized that center position. It's one of those spots where I don't think you realize how important it is until you don't have a guy. And I watched so many Jets centers. If you want to entertain yourself, you can go back to one of the early years of this podcast, and there's a pretty good chance, no matter what episode you listen to, I'm complaining about whoever the Jets center was, because they were just so bad at that position. And I appreciate what McGovern's brought to the table. I think the Jets were willing to let him go, though. They did not show much urgency last offseason in trying to bring him back. And it was almost a situation where he came back for such a cheap price that they were like, okay, I guess we have to take him back that's all he's going to cost. It was almost like they wanted to get rid of him, but they just couldn't because the deal was too good to pass up. So what this tells me is that Jets want Tippmann. I mean, they've invested much more in Joe Tippmann. They've shown much more interest in Joe Tippmann. Joe Tippmann's the guy they want to win. But they put themselves in a nice spot because if Joe Tippmann's not ready to go, well, he can work on the practice field. And McGovern can start at least the beginning of the season, and then maybe Tippmann works his way in. He earns the job in practice, or maybe there's an injury, it happens organically, and maybe somebody slides to a different spot. Tippmann could slide to guard. Maybe he could even play tackle, or maybe you slide McGovern to guard. So it could work itself out organically. I think if all things are equal, the Jets will go with Tippmann because he's the rookie, because he's the guy they invested a lot in. The tackle position's much more complex. The Jets have said that there's an open competition at left tackle. Robert Saleh, and this is in response mainly to Mekhi Becton giving an interview a few weeks back where and also a tweet where he tweeted out, "I'm a left tackle," and he gave an interview where he was very critical of the Jets for moving him to right tackle last year. In fact, he kind of suggested that played a role in him getting re-injured and missing the entire season. Robert Saleh said in response to that, "You want to be the left tackle? Go win the job." Are the Jets going to give Becton a chance to win the left tackle job? It's not really clear. In fact, there were some rumblings over the last couple of days that Becton's not even in line to start. I've been assuming that he was going to be the starting right tackle, but listen to some of the people around the team. They're kind of suggesting that maybe Billy Turner, who was a veteran free agent signing at the right tackle position, is the favorite to win that job. And on the first day of practice, Dwayne Brown was not in the starting lineup. Dwayne Brown was not working with the starters. It was Billy Turner at left tackle, not Mekhi Becton. Mekhi Becton was left tackle with the second unit, which was quarterbacked, of course, by Zach Wilson. And I have to say, I do think Mekhi Becton should be given a chance to earn the job. Nothing against Billy Turner, who I think for the point he was signed right after the draft, as a guy who's a depth player, not a bad player, a guy Aaron Rodgers is comfortable with. And listen, on a lot of levels, I'll defer to the quarterback who's praised an offensive lineman in the past. I mean, the offensive linemen are the guys who protect you or they get you hit. So if Aaron Rodgers is willing to vouch for Billy Turner being on this roster, then that's fine. And I think Billy Turner's played well enough that he's a good third or fourth tackle. I don't know that he's the guy that I want starting if I have the option of Mekhi Becton, the guy with his ability. I certainly don't know that he's the guy I want starting at left tackle if anything happens to Dwayne Brown. And Dwayne Brown's also kind of near the end of his career. So I would like to see Becton in the mix. Now, is he going to be? Well, you never want to overreact to one day of practice. Yes, Becton was with the second team on day one of practice. That doesn't necessarily mean Becton's out of the mix. You also don't want to underreact, though. The fact he's starting, the first practice with the second team, I don't think that's completely meaningless. It's a long camp. There will be preseason games where Becton will have an opportunity to show the coaching staff what he can do. So I'm not saying that, Becton's definitely on the outs with this coaching staff, but it's worth keeping an eye on. It's one of those things. Sometimes these early training camp storylines, they amount to nothing. Sometimes you look back and you say, you know what? That was there at the very start of the training camp. And then you also have Max Mitchell, who's entering year 2, a 4th-round pick last year, got plenty of starting experience a year ago. And, he did his best. He wasn't really supposed to be playing. I think the perception of Max Mitchell is actually quite a bit better than the reality was. But, with an offseason to work, with an offseason to lift weights, to add bulk, kind of a wild card in the mix for the Jets, and certainly a guy they could use all the depth they can get on the offensive line. So if Mitchell is able to step in, even in a backup role, I think it would be a positive thing. I think really the action right now is at center and, maybe a tackle if they give Becton a shot, which I certainly think they should do. All due respect to Dwayne Brown, who's had a phenomenal career, and Billy Turner, who's been a solid player. They're both on the wrong side of 30. Might be worthwhile to give this young player who's at least got a lot of physical ability the opportunity to show what he can do, and at least a fair opportunity to get into the lineup. Now, here on the Locked On podcast, we'll turn our attention to a spot where the Jets have to feel pretty good, and that's the defensive line. We'll discuss the defensive line rotation ahead here on this Friday edition of the Locked On Jets podcast. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by eBay Motors. Our partners at eBay Motors have teamed up with Locked On Fantasy Football host Vinny Iyer to bring you some of the best fantasy picks each week, all season long. Whether you are prepping for a draft or scouting the waiver wire, every week we are going to provide you with players who are guaranteed to fit on your roster. So with draft prep underway for the upcoming season, let's see who Vinny has picked out for this week's eBay's Guaranteed Fit Fantasy Picks of the Week. Looking to make a smooth turn in fantasy football snake drafts with the last pick of the first round and first pick of the second round? Catch an initial spark for your roster by revving up two elite NFC East wide receivers, Cowboys CeeDee Lamb and the Eagles A.J. Brown. A letter-perfect guaranteed early fit. Count on Lamb driving Dak Prescott and the Dallas New Look passing game to big numbers, and Brown revving up Jalen Hurts' downfield throwing often again in Philadelphia. Vinny Iyer from Locked On Fantasy Football is going to help you win your fantasy championship. And eBay Motors knows a championship team is all about each player being a perfect fit. Same goes with your vehicle. With eBay Guaranteed Fit and over 122 million parts and accessories for your vehicle right at your fingertips, you can make sure your ride stays running smoothly. Air filters, brakes, batteries, taillights, alterations, shocks, struts, you name it. eBay Motors has it. And they will make sure it's the right fit for your car because eBay Guaranteed Fit helps you understand exactly what parts you need for your vehicle the first time. So go forth, switch gears, crank up the AC, and say goodbye to sweating if your ride needs a little fixing up, because right now, you know you'll always be set up for success from the get-go. With eBay Guaranteed Fit, everything your vehicle is calling for is just a click away. For the parts and accessories that fit your vehicle, just look for the green check. Get the right parts, the right fit, and the right prices at ebaymotors.com. Let's ride. eBay Guaranteed Fit. Only available to U.S. customers. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listen or first watch every day. You everydayers, want to give you a big shout out. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets. We have new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday, and then bonus episodes as needed if news breaks. Today we're focusing on the trenches, where the Jets stand on the offensive line, the defensive line, and the linebacker position. Now let's turn to the defensive line. It is one of the deepest spots on the roster. Jets have a very good group up front. And I think that's by design. I think when you look at the way the roster is built, you see kind of the philosophy of Robert Saleh, where Robert Saleh likes to move guys in and out of the game on the defensive line. He likes to keep everybody fresh. And for whatever reason, this approach has gotten a lot of criticism. And I look at this and I don't really quite understand why people are so upset with the rotation on the defensive line. Because first of all, the Jets have a lot of good defensive linemen. So, if you had a team where you only had like 4 or 5 good defensive linemen, I guess I could understand it. You'd say, well, we'll keep your best players on the field. Jets have a lot of good defensive linemen. It's a philosophical thing with Saleh, and I can't disagree with it. And this goes back to, and maybe this is being biased because of things that happened over a decade ago. I think back to when Rex Ryan was the coach, and there really is not much bad you can say about the defenses Rex ran, especially in those early years. Really, the one flaw that those defenses had, and maybe it was just bad luck, but those defenses really struggled to close out games in the fourth quarter. It felt like the Jets, when in those situations, even in those good years, they'd always give up the big drive that would allow the other team to tie the game, sometimes to win the game. And when I think about that, I kind of like the idea of rotating guys in and out of the game on the defensive line, because you want guys fresh to close games out. You want guys in the fourth quarter to not be gasping for air with their hands on their hips. You want them to be, you want your best guys to be able to go into the game and get the big sack. And if somebody is tired, you want to be able to send in a replacement. Going up against a hurry up offense, sometimes you get a little exhausted. It's very easy playing on the defensive line. You want to be able to send somebody in who can get to the quarterback, who is, even if he's a substitute, he's going to be a very good player. Now, the one thing I will say, people have been complaining a lot about the Jets rotating Quinnen Williams in and out. Now, in a typical game last year, Quinnen Williams was playing about 2 out of every 3 snaps. I guess you could argue maybe we get him up to 3 out of 4. But again, I feel like that's almost a nitpick, because, how bad was Quinnen Williams' usage last year when he produced at that level? I don't know. Maybe if he played more, he wouldn't have been as effective. Maybe the fact that he only played 2 out of every 3 snaps gave him, the ability to go harder. I think that's a possibility. I wouldn't hate it if they, stuck him out there a little bit more frequently, but I think it's kind of strange off the year Quinnen Williams is having to complain about his usage. That's just me, though. But Jets can rotate guys in and out. Now, I think at the defensive end position, their top guy will once again be Carl Lawson. He's a very good player, a guy who I feel like is almost a little underrated because he doesn't, he's about like a 6 to 8 sack guy a year instead of a 10 to 12 sack guy, but generates a ton of pressure. And one of these years, I think if he generates pressure at the rate he typically does, he's going to get to the quarterback, a really good speed rusher. Then on the other side, John Franklin Myers, who essentially become a full-time defensive end. And, he may have to slide a little bit more inside this year after the Jets lost their best defensive tackle in Sheldon Rankins, but Franklin Myers a good defensive end. And you just have a lot of young talent at the defensive end position. You've got Jermaine Johnson, who, the Jets, I mean, it's your typical training camp talk, but there's a lot of buzz about Jermaine Johnson, about how Jets are expecting him to break out this year. We'll see, but I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility. He was a first-round pick a year ago. You have Bryce Huff, who has just turned into one of the truly outstanding, one of the top situational pass rushers in the league. He doesn't play much on rundowns. In fact, I would like to see him play with a few more rundowns this year. I mean, it's not like the Jets, not like, Carl Lawson's a phenomenal run defender. I wouldn't mind seeing, but again, he plays limited snaps. Last year, I think it was around 90% of his snaps were passing attempts by the opponent, and that shows you that he plays typically on passing downs. Great speed rusher. Now, for situations where other teams know he's just going to fly up the field, he still generated pressures at a very high clip. And then you also have the first-round pick this year, Will McDonald, who is going to try and get his feet wet in the NFL this year. I'm not expecting big things, but I hope he looks like he belongs. I hope he's able to register a couple of sacks. Then you look inside at tackle. We talked about Quinnen Williams, who what an outstanding player. You can't say enough about Quinnen Williams. Just made a couple of veteran signings from Seattle at the defensive tackle position. And it's kind of interesting because they got one run stopper at defensive tackle and then one guy who's more of a pass rusher. The pass rusher is Quentin Jefferson, been a solid player, solid pass rusher through much of his career. Al Woods is kind of the bigger run stopping guy at defensive tackle who, actually is not a typical Robert Saleh player because Robert Saleh tends to want guys who rush the passer. He doesn't, he wants guys to play to run, but you also have to rush the passer. There typically aren't any run-stopping specialists like space eaters, but Al Woods is one of them. And then another guy I have my eye on this year is Michael Clemens, second-year guy out of Texas A&M. Solid rookie season, one of the standouts at training camp last year, who sounds like he's kind of bulked up this year. I think you could see him on the end a la John Franklin Myers, but you could also see him more on the inside this year, a guy with a lot of power in his game. And, you talk about position battles. I don't know that there's necessarily a lot of position battles on the defensive line. I think it might be more who gets what playing time allocation. Can somebody bump up their snap total, by 10% or something like that with a strong preseason? I think it's far less about whether you are in the whether who's starting and who's coming off the bench, because everybody's going to play on this defensive line. Everybody's going to get their fair share of snaps in the Robert Saleh defense. It's the way it should be, and it's the way the Jets are built. So I've got no complaints about it. If you do have complaints, I'd ask you to reconsider. Now, here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll close out our show. We will turn our attention to the linebacker position. There's a player to keep your eye on, a guy who, potential breakout candidate this year. I'll tell you who that is as we continue this Friday edition of the Locked On Jets podcast. This is the Locked On Jets podcast here on this Friday. We're talking about the trenches. We've talked about the offensive line and defensive line. Let's move to the linebacker position. I feel bad about this because I usually try and end the show on a positive note. And linebacker is objectively one of the weakest positions on the Jets. And it's funny because you could say, well, CJ Mosley was second team All-Pro last year, who was a Pro Bowler. I feel like a lot of that was based on reputation. I feel like when you have a guy who is as decorated as CJ Mosley and a defense as good as the Jets were last year, it kind of sways voters. I think especially in the passing game. I mean, there were games that the home game against New England, the Patriots were just taking advantage. They were going after him on third down plays. I know the numbers actually look pretty decent for Mosley, but I got to say, I think this is a situation where the numbers don't match up with the actual production. I just remember that Patriots game where the Patriots kept going after him on third down. Even though the coverage numbers weren't bad last year, I think everybody knows Mosley's not a strong guy in coverage, and neither is Quincy Wilson, who just got paid. So you have a guy who was a Pro Bowler and All-Pro, and another guy who just got a lucrative contract extension, and here I am saying linebacker's kind of a weak spot, but I think it is a weak spot on the defense. I don't think either guy's a strong coverage guy. I think Mosley's still pretty good against the run. I don't think he's a great fit for Robert Saleh's defense. I think Saleh likes a more mobile linebacker, and even though Mosley has, kind of shed some weight through the years, tried to get faster. He's not a great fit. I think Quincy Williams is very fast. His issue is just, he's kind of like the home run hitter in baseball who hits a lot of home runs, but also strikes out a lot. Lots of times he kind of is over aggressive and overruns plays and, fills the wrong gap and allows some plays to go against him. Sometimes he's over aggressive as a tackler, not a great coverage guy. It's not the worst linebacker group in the league. I think if Williams and Mosley cost maybe like 1/3 of what they cost, you could live with it. Well, you have to live with it anyway, but I feel like this is just a group it's not an awful linebacker group. It's just, I think, a group that makes too much money. So, but the third linebacker spot's interesting. And part of the reason it's interesting is, everybody says the Jets run a 4-3 defense, but really, for the most part, they run a 4-2-5. In today's NFL, it's a passing league. Teams put 3 receivers on the field. Defenses put 5 defensive backs on the field. So Michael Carter II is almost like the Jets' third linebacker, if you want to look at it that way, because he's the guy who plays closer to the line of scrimmage. He's essentially got run back or line assignments when the Jets are in nickel, and he also has to cover guys out of the slot. The third linebacker this year, there's still people looking at Quan Alexander. Would not hate Quan coming back. I thought he played well last year. Probably the Jets' best coverage linebacker a year ago. But Jamien Sherwood's also getting a lot of buzz, and this could be your typical. You hear this a lot about young players, how much better these guys. Every year you hear about how the young player looks so much better this year, how everything has changed. But in today's NFL, the third linebacker, at least as far as the Jets go, he's kind of a part-time player. And I know Sherwood was a late-round pick a couple of years ago. Would it be that out of the realm of possibility for Jamien Sherwood to step into a more prominent role, a part-time role as the third linebacker? Is it that crazy to think it could happen? I mean, I don't think so. And beyond that, you need like some day 3 picks. You need a day 3 pick or 2 to step into a part-time role because it's too hard to find veterans. I guess you could bring Quan back, but it really helped the Jets out that Jamien Sherwood was able to step into a role. CJ Mosley was praising him a lot yesterday. Again, how much does it mean? I don't know, but I don't think it's like that far out of the realm of possibility that Jamien Sherwood could play. And, the Jets on defense, I think it's clear what they were trying to do a couple of years ago when they drafted Sherwood and Hamza Nasruddin on day 3. A pair of college safeties who they converted to linebacker. And the amount of criticism the Jets have gotten for this is something I don't quite understand. It's not like the Jets are the first team that's taken college safeties and tried to move them to linebacker. It happens a lot, and people are acting like this is like an outrageous move. That how could the Jets do something like this? How could they think it could work? Look, if it doesn't work out, it's the plan of moving safeties to linebacker. It's not that's not the reason. I mean, it actually makes sense because safeties are typically better cover guys than linebackers. So if you take a guy with like safety cover skills, you kind of give yourself a better defense in today's NFL. And I think really what the concept is, Jets are trying to kind of make the third linebacker turn into kind of a big nickel type of guy where you've got defensive back cover skills and linebacker run stopping. Now, safety is not as good against the run as a linebacker and not as good in coverage as a corner, but typically they're better against the run in a corner and better in coverage than a linebacker. So essentially, I think that's kind of the goal you're trying to get there. And, as a guy with safety cover skills at linebacker, he could be your best cover linebacker. So I really don't think it's that outrageous to think Jamien Sherwood could fill the linebacker role. Safeties, generally are faster than linebackers. So you add a little bit extra speed when you're trying to play the 4-3 against teams that go bigger on offense, maybe teams that play 2 tight end sets or teams that play 2 running backs in the tight end, 2 wide receiver sets where you have to put a linebacker on the field. Maybe it gives your defense a little bit more speed, a little bit more flexibility. I do think the Quan situation is going to tell you a lot about what they think about Sherwood because I think we're at this point of the year, Quan Alexander is coming back. No matter who he signs with, it's going to be a cheap 1-year deal. It's one even with the Jets in a relatively tight cap situation. And somebody's going to say the Jets have like $24 million in cap space. That's just on paper right now. They still have to redo the Aaron Rodgers contract. They still have to, sign their practice squad guys. They still have, they want to keep a little bit extra in the bank when they need to sign players in season. So I know somebody's going to respond with that. So I'll rebut that right off the bat. But the Jets are kind of tied up against the cap right now, and they could afford Quan Alexander nevertheless. I still think they can afford him, But if they have confidence in Sherwood, going with the young player is not a bad move. You got to find young talent. You got to develop young talent. So I'll be interested to see what happens with Sherwood. Love to hear your thoughts. But that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you're listening on the podcast source, give this show a 5-star review. If you're watching on YouTube, give this episode a big thumbs up. And it helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Hope you have a great weekend, everybody. We'll be back on Monday to talk more Jets.